Welcome, everyone. I want to do this very quickly. In the biological blurb that was sent around, many of you may have read that Frank Salomon is the John B. Mura Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Adjunct Professor of Anthropology at the University of Iowa. He's an ethnographer and an ethnohistorian of the Andes, received his PhD at Cornell in 1978, and is the author of, I've got some of his books up here, and if they look a little bit ratty, it's because these are scans of my own copies of these books. He is the author of Native Lords of Quito in the Age of the Incas, the Huarochiri manuscript, Testament of Ancient and Colonial Andean Religion, Los Yumbos, Niguas y Tzachila o Colorados durante la Colonia Española, Cambridge History of the Native Peoples of the Americas, South America, the Cord Keepers, which I made a bet with someone in 2004 would win the American Society for Ethnohistory Book of the Year, the Wheeler Boglin Prize, and it did. And I mentioned this to Dr. Salomon the first time we met, and he said, well, I hope you made some money off the bet. And it did indeed win that prestigious award. La Revisita de 1588, The Lettered Mountain, and as we just heard from Dr. Haug, his most recent book, At the Mountain's Altar, is an outstanding anthropology of religion text. And as Dr. Haug mentioned, we had talked about this before, that he used it in his Anthropology of Religion course. And I heard both from Professor Haug himself and independently from students how much they loved this book. And it really is a terrific book. I cannot overstate my respect and esteem for Frank Salomon for his life's work, which always somehow combines the most thorough, painstaking ethnographic data and rigorous theory expanding thought with sparkling prose qualifies as true literature. Almost every day when I'm working, I think, I wish I could ask Frank about this, or I wonder what Frank would make of this. My students can attest to this, and those that have taken classes from me can also attest to this. I always think of Dr. Salomon, and I mentioned this to him once, and he scoffed at it. I always think of him as sort of our special genius that we get, meaning those of us that work in the Andes, we get to have him. And I have it on good authority that a very prominent anthropologist that wrote letters of recommendation for Dr. Salomon started the letters with, Frank Salomon is a genius. I couldn't agree more. In the acknowledgements of my dissertation, I say I've also been extremely fortunate to associate with Frank Salomon, the non-Peruvian Savio de Huarochiri, and just about everywhere else for that matter. That's a play on the famous anthropologist Julio Cetello, Peruvian anthropologist who is known as the wise man of Huarochiri. And Frank is the non-Peruvian Savio de Huarochiri. And I mentioned that, Frank, each time I read or reread a work of yours, it is a revelation. I'll quickly tell a story of the first time substantially met Frank. It was arranged that we would travel up to Huarochiri together, where I wanted to carry out doctoral research. And Dr. Salomon was on his way to Tupicocha, and one of his doctoral students arranged it so that we could meet up and travel up together. And this just, this was beyond what I could hope for. Dr. Salomon was on his way up to deliver the newly Spanish translated copy of his award-winning Cord Keepers. And so I was very nervous around him and very conscious of this, and most surely did not want to crash his party. He was also going to be giving a talk in the municipality. And so when we got to Tupicocha, we parted ways, and I hiked off to another area. I was working out my survey boundaries, but I ended up spending the night vomiting and had to come back to Tupicocha. And because I did, I of course planned on going to the talk. And a Limeño teacher, someone was from the capital city of Lima, was up in the town, and he saw me and he knew that the talk was going on. I think there was even a loudspeaker announcing Frank Salomon will be giving a talk this afternoon. And this teacher said, oh, are you here for the talk also? Are you an anthropologist? And I said, yes. And he said, oh, great. Well, then you can speak at it too, which terrible. You know, no way. I said, no, no. I'm not here to do this. And this guy kept insisting. And I was like, no, you don't understand. This is Frank Salomon. And I'm meeting him for the first time. And I don't want to. And he's like, well, if he's as great as you're saying he is, then surely he won't mind, you know, if you break in and speak a little bit at his event. And no, absolutely not. And it actually got to the point where he got this teacher from Lima got offended that I was just flat out, there's no way, I refuse this. And I went to the talk and sat at the back and was listening to Dr. Salomon, terrific talk. And then after about 20 minutes or a half hour, suddenly Dr. Salomon said, and now why don't we hear a few words from our archaeologist friend sitting at the back. It ended up working out that way anyway, but I bring this up to say that such is Dr. Salomon's graciousness, and our graduate students and some of the faculty experienced this yesterday in our lunchtime talk with Dr. Salomon. Let me just finish with, I hadn't shown a picture of this, the Huarochiri manuscript that he translated together with George Ariosti and did the spectacular job on this with the toponyms and the footnotes, and it's magnificent. But in 2013, we were speaking at a symposium that was being held at the Catholic University in Lima, and I was thrilled to be on the same bill with Frank Salomon. It was, you know, again, and I asked him to if he would autograph my copy of the Huarochiri manuscript. And I think perhaps he was a bit chagrined at the fawning of this zealous adult graduate student / fanboy asking for an autograph of this work of his. But I didn't care. I was, you know, I was Frank Salomon. And so I handed him my copy, and he was looking for a place to sign it. He said, boy, you've got notes all over the place here. Where can I sign it? I was thinking of how I could quickly communicate the brilliance of this man. I thought of this. So imagine for a second, on the fly, you know, fanboy has said, can you sign this? And he's looking through saying, well, where should I sign this? And in the table of contents, as you can see, there's supplement 1, supplement 2. This is on the fly. And after the index, he adds a section, dedication, yours, Zach, and mine, with appreciation and high hopes, Frank. That ought to communicate how brilliant Frank Salomon is. And I ask you to join me in welcoming him.
So Frank, we'll turn it over to you. I did fail to make a programming note. If you have questions, so we will have a Q&A afterwards. So we'd encourage all of you students, if you have questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat, and let's hear from Professor Salomon.
Wonderful. Okay, here comes my PowerPoint. Is my sound clear?
Yep, and the PowerPoint's there. We're good.
Okay. So it all starts here. This is the Huarochiri manuscript, which was just sketched by Zach. The single greatest and most astonishing legacy from pre-Columbian times, not necessarily Inca times. And you can see here on the first page of it, the intention of this anonymous author. It's from him that we have an idea about the relation between humans and the non-human world. The Huarochiri mythology often builds on an image of irrigation as sexuality. This is a work of art by Daphne Sola, the wife of my first Quechua teacher, in which she sought to imagine the union of loving flesh, which is at the same time the union of human society with the mountain glaciers and waters. In the lower canal, we see Chukisuso, this female person who incarnates the waters of irrigation, who has been freshly seduced by Pariacaca in the upper canal. Pariacaca, the great, truly imposing snow-capped mountain, which is the patron of this region. She beguiles him with desire, and he beguiles her with hydraulic power. He opens a canal for her field in exchange for a durable sexual union. She produces fertility, and from it, he is fed and celebrated. So she has taught water to be a husband. She has made the mountains into the husbandmen of the agricultural system. Their reciprocal relationship between watering and harvesting will give permanent life and sustenance to both of them. This hour is about another facet of the circulating world, the circulation of knowledge. John Tracy was a wonderful geographer colleague who did very good work on the spaces of Huarochiri and then died young. But I'd like to remember him for a moment with the telling words, Yaku Yachachi, teaching water. And the quote below gives us an idea of what we're working with today. Tracy's study in the Rio Colca and that of Valderrama and Escalante and several other great scholars, as well as Paul Gellis's equally terrific studies in Casta Huarochiri, all emphasize that fertility and nurturance between earth and people is executed through exchange of knowledge. I'd like to talk about the independence of humans and lands in terms of know-how, and especially the flow of knowledge in its verbal form. In our age, verbal form means writing as well as speech. And these will be the leitmotifs of it. A discussion in two parts. The first part is about the culture of writing as I researched it in 2002 and subsequently, mostly in the southern Peruvian province of Azángaro, which is at the north end of Lake Titicaca. It's mostly a high plain, 12,600 feet and up, freezing cold, chronically poor, and conflicted, but very rich in language because it is trilingual among Spanish, Aymara, and Quechua. Its history of writing acquisition equally is fascinating and conflictive. The second part which I hope I have enough time for, applies these thoughts about the ethos of writing to water in Huarochiri province, which is a segment of the westward Pacific Cordillera slope from sea level up to the snow caps at about 16,000 feet. In 2002, I worked part-time at la Universidad Nacional del Altiplano in Puno, which borders Asángaro. There I worked with Emilio Chambi, a very smart and original local man, literate in all three languages, and of interest to me, the son of a perito, or a popular scribe. These are not notaries, they're not legal secretaries, they're just country people who have learned in an artisan way many things about writing and reading. The title that's they're said to be peritos, which means experts in Spanish, but as that word is absorbed into Quechua, it's pronounced perito. We visited far and wide, separately and together, in the many small villages of the Asángaro High Plains, and recruited a team of paid student assistants at that university who were themselves sons and daughters of Altiplano villages. Not anthropologists, they were people aspiring to be veterinarians or nurses or accountants or any number of other things, but they knew the languages. And those students asked all sorts of people what kind of writing they kept, what is important, what's right and wrong in the practice of writing. And when we had permission as well to make detailed records of what rural archives consist of. This is a little more than a routine research transaction because there is an ingrained and completely wrong notion that the Andes are an oral society and that in some way the ethos of letters is a foreign imposition. I want to tell you that quite the opposite is true. Many of the traits and practices of what we now call Andean culture derive from interactions between the long oppressed and often conflict-lashed rural countryside and the lettered city. It's true that there were intervals when writing was literally forbidden to Indians, so-called, especially after the 18th century Tupac Amaru rebellion and in the later 19th when latifundism on the part of wool-producing estates gobbled up the high plains and tried to disable the people called indigenous. In that time, the ancestors of today's Asangarinos acquired by homemade clandestine means the art of writing in alphabetic characters, or others learned it through conversion to literate dissident ideologies such as Seventh-day Adventism, anarcho-syndicalism, and indigenism. When public, military, and religious literacy, government schools and so forth arrived, they were monolingual vectors of writing and constrained by exogenous rules. So The Andean ethos of literacy is actually a sort of fusion and frequently a friction between these two strains, these two vectors of the lettered form of civilization. In the 1990s, when I was just getting interested in these things, the literacy of Andean campesinos was often labeled violence of the word. And that took that sort of adhered to subaltern studies for a decade. But I think there's a lot more to it. It's a life or death matter to protect writings. This is the spirit and soul that maintains one as an owner, said one of these campesinos. Ancient papers are deeply respected, even when they deal with lands that no longer belong to the family. This is due not only to possible future relevance in claims, but the fact that they specify names and surnames, anchoring lineages to lands and holy places. Old paper helps people think about the always fascinating and useful subject of genealogy. These are vernacular functions. They're not mandated by the official purposes for which papers were made, and they're not understood by outsiders. Writings are permanent and precious. Their ownership is a closely guarded matter. Usually they are held in a location that also holds the family's most important and valuable possessions. Although literacy was, and to some degree still is, more prevalent among males, the guardianship of females, papers is often female. Today, with well over 90% of rural people censused as literate, and in parentheses, sometimes one is not sure what's meant by that, women still expect men to be good at paperwork. You wouldn't want to marry a poorly lettered man because he'd be bad at managing property or litigating. Titles and lawsuits are the most crucial papers. Most landowners keep at least one bundle that they call papel, which means land paper. Today's talk is not about the quipus, which I've attended to so many times, but I just want to point out in parenthesis that in the Titicaca Basin, at the time of these studies, some people still had a simplified knowledge of the quipu medium. This one belongs to an elderly widower who keeps it tied to a peg next to the outer door of his house as a way of rapidly noting down debts, calendar obligations, or things that need to be done. Not just chords, but all the material culture of information keeping is of great interest to household. It's a regular little cultural focus. Ritual in the Andean style, the complex of invocations and sacrifices that has been so much discussed in the context of recent ontological or new animist anthropology, also saturates the rural culture of letters. There's a feeling that letters, writings are sentient moral entities. They exist on both sides of what foreigners call the culture or nature divide. It's wrong to think that what we call Andean culture is alien to letters. A lot of what we call Andean is done and conserved, conducted and remembered through papers. This is what one knowledgeable person said about why transactions involving papers have a ritual dimension. Everything they hear that's said with regard to the word goods also applies to papers. So for example, if a family is involved in an upcoming litigation, they will often organize a chaya in the presence of the evidential papers, begging them, urging them to make themselves strong and persuasive so that they will convince other people. Writing also articulates kinship. That became more and more important after 1950, when people began in great numbers to take up work in cities or to maintain double domicile. This is a letter from a man who went to work and live in Tacna on the Chilean border to his family in Asángaro. And the interesting thing about it is that the purpose of the letter is to show people how to write a letter so that his relatives will be able to reply to him. Receiving and sending letters was a matter of some social warmth. Usually at that time, only one or two people in a family would be good at reading handwriting, but the gathering would include other members who had a social title to be interested in the message. And so translating and paraphrasing and collective reading was the way of taking possession of a letter. I heard for an example of the importance of collective reading and translation. One of these men who went to the coastal cities wrote back to his wife saying that he was gonna agarrar nueva empleada. And his wife went ballistic because the phrase sounds like it means I'm gonna grab my household employee. But the translation discussion cleared it up. It wasn't that he'd confessed an impropriety, but simply that he was a little awkward in Spanish and he'd chosen a verb that has a sexual connotation. Other prized papers are family trees, again, notably among Aymara-speaking families. You could think of these as being guides to the reading of land papers and many other family values. Family values are also fused in writing through domestic economy and reciprocity. The characteristic relationship is what's called aini. Aini means a prestation in the form of a non-monetary, or today it can also be a monetary loan with no due date and no interest. Instead of due date or interest, its value to the giver and the receiver is to constitute economic support that also includes social support. When a wedding takes place, all the guests make ainis, and of course, by the time a couple is somewhat mature, like these people, They've accumulated more ainis than they can carry in their head. Part of the festivity would usually be a fellow like this man with the paper, who's the aini scribe. And when I saw impressive lists of ainis in rural households, one of the owners said, "I just don't know how we could get along without them." Likewise, writing controls property and other rights. I won't say much about it because this is the part of the picture that has been researched by others. It's the work of a perito or popular scribe to be the chair or the organizers of land transactions. In this case, this is called a pasmi. It's a division of lands among heirs. And that is a matter of some ritual as well as economic sensitivity, because dividing inherited lands is felt to be somewhat offensive to the land beings. Writing carries expressive culture. Songbooks are very valuable, and they're sometimes held quite secretly because they help the owner win prizes in song contests. Song contests sometimes have substantial prizes. This is a homemade Quechua transcription of some popular songs. And it has a secondary interest to me because since the world of literacy is a Spanish code in this part of the world, writing in Quechua is considered a sort of eccentric vocation. I often asked people people who were good writers if they wrote in Quechua. Some of them laughed at me. They thought I was kidding. But yet these same people, faced with a good reason to write Quechua, can do quite a creditable job of homemade transcribing. And writing is the vital information medium of community organization, even in realms that don't belong to the state. This is a page of the master notebook of social organization in the village of Rapaz, which is in Provincia Oyon, another village which is famous for having a patrimony of quipus, and that is it. The quipus of Rapaz are very strange. They don't look at all like Incaic format. They are basically unilineal, but the single line of the carrier cord is very busy with attachments of little thingies, which are apparently the meaningful elements. And for a very long time, I schmoozed and asked and looked for possible meanings of these things. I still don't know, but I think the most plausible hypothesis that I got was a man who had held several offices in the community and said that these are similar things. These cords might be the career records of stakeholders in the community. To be a reputable comunero, you have to perform during your life a large number of service obligations and a smaller number of leadership obligations. These are the listings of one comunero's achievements in leadership roles. When he has achieved enough of them, and when he's 65 years old, he'll be eligible to change status into a pasivo, which means a person who still has full community privileges, but only half duties. In Tupicocha, the subject of cord keepers, of course, quipus are very much entwined with the art of writing. So here is a man signing on to become the new president or representative of his ayllu, of the pre-Columbian corporation that he belongs to. As he wears the quipu insignia of that ayllu, namely Primera Yauca, and provides his authentication in another code. The parcialidades are my true love in Huarochiri. They're remarkable. These are kinship structured corporations, depending mostly on patrilineal descent, which form the modules, the indispensable modules of communities. A community can be understood as a confederation of little groups like this one. They are the owners of the old quipus, and they also keep an archive of their own doings, such as their routine monthly meetings on papers. I am not suggesting something fossilized or miraculously static. Ayllus are political corporations that adapt to everything. Empires come and go, republics come and go. Ayllus keep it up. When Peru underwent an almost revolutionary change of regime in 1920, which first embodied the notion that indigenous villages might be politically recognized entities, well then the modules that make up indigenous communities, namely the parcialidades, imposed on themselves a cycle of reforms in which they wrote basic statutes or constitutions to make themselves more homological with state legal institutions. So, summing up these written practices, let's try to take home some principles about the ethos of writing. Good writs are to and from responsible parties. A valuable paper has to be from somebody to somebody. If that is not clear, it'll be suspected and rejected. They have to have physical integrity. As you know, people are very picky about the physical state. They have to have a reinforced reciprocity value, not just documentary value, but ritual support, such as chayas, etc., that demonstrate enduring social commitment to the papers and imbuing them with the force of commitment within the system of reciprocities. They're evocative. They have some emotional value. Even seemingly boring papers really get pored over because they mention the names, dates, places, lands of people who have left this world. This is a society in which inherited keepsakes exist, but they're relatively scarce. Knowing names and remembering people's presence in these acts of agency is very much enjoyed. And finally, intelligibility or language code is not really a criterion of merit. If something has the above values, the fact that it's hard to understand, for example, if one doesn't know Spanish very well, or the fact that it's written in an archaic handwriting, do not make it any the less valuable. On the contrary, throwing away documents is quite a shady activity. People don't like to be seen scrapping paper, however obsolete it might be. The only time of year when you might get away with it is on San Juan Day, when there's a ritual that involves lighting fires. And if you want to get rid of paper, you just drop it in there in the firewood so it won't be noticed. Pervasive meaningfulness. All the visible traits of a writ are understood to carry meanings. When they're copied, they are not transcribed. They are not under the canons of Saussurean linguistics. In Saussurean linguistics, a writing is a collection of signs which contrast with each other in a consistent way. As long as the contrasts are consistent, the physical character of the sign is not important. So if we decided for no reason that from now on we want to write letter B with an asterisk, as long as that is established within the usual set of contrasts between B and other consonants, it wouldn't make any difference. Not so with Andean papers. This is a transcription by the best paleographer in Tupicocha, Leon Modesto Rojas. Notice that when he transcribes every last curlicue, abbreviation, scratch out, ink spot, because this is felt to be the facsimile, or the, even more than that, the present trace of social actions rather than of speech sounds. And that's why people are still so interested in physical mutations. This kind of writing was done, it's called wool powder. And why is it significant? Because the tiny hamlet of Huayrapampa first acquired clandestine writing, unauthorized writing, from a person returning from prison where he had learned some letters. There was no writing equipment in the town. He made an improvised blackboard or a letter display to show people how to do it by sticking onto a surface gooey, sticky stuff. Might be real goo, or it might be some animal subproduct in the shape of the letter, and dropping onto it the dust that's left behind on a shearing floor. That's why it's called wool dust. This happened probably sometime in the neighborhood of 1912, but people preciously hang on to the memories of writing's physical traits. So when people look at an old paper, usually they'll say, that's ink made of soot. That's ink made of oxidized blue potato. Each of these, that's made with a quill. That's made with a ballpoint. And from that, they will supply the rough chronology of the papers. Bad writs. Since paper has all these moral qualities that I've been discussing, you have to also think about immoral qualities. The authenticity and social value of writing is a matter of some nervousness. Writings might contain the opposite of good social ritual support. They might contain sorcery. If they are anonymous, who knows what their purpose they're serving? If they're spurious, if they are non-unique, that is to say, if they're mechanical copies, not liked. I was surprised to find that in Asangaro at that time, the larger villages had Xerox machines, which were especially useful to teachers and town officials, but rural people didn't like them. And I asked why, and they said, because they're fake. They're not from anybody. Alterations like mutilation, all of that is a bad vibe. This is the most important bad writ that I ran into. In the village of Rapaz, the archive contains this document, which claims to be the primordial title of the lands of Rapaz from the time of the Incas and the time of the Egyptian pharaohs, with a long page of pseudo-historical baloney written in an imitated 17th century handwriting. This is what the historian Jorge Basadre spotted as the fakes of Cadorcio. Cadorcio was a professional document faker who traveled through many towns of rural Peru, leaving behind him these falsifications. Quite a sensitive matter for me, of course. People don't really want to hear that their archive contains fakes. Another kind of bad paper, nightmare paper. Papel apach means the paper carrier. Another word for that role is curristo, the mailman. That's correísta, rendered in Quechua. The nightmare mailman. What's going on here? This is a genre of horror stories that circulate in oral folk tradition. In the bad days, the days of latifundist oppression, the latifundistas required every village to supply by turns a mail carrier. There was at that time no service by national mail. The mail carrier was given papers and had to walk all the way from Asangaro to Arequipa, which is an extremely arduous journey. It means walking right over the highest, coldest, loneliest, bandit-infested high plains. The messages could not be read. The mailman carried messages without knowing what they were. They carried them through dangerous places, and in this genre of folk tales, they fall into the hands of horrible beings, such as cannibals or the living dead, and that's the action of the story, how the clever mailman manages to work his way out of a mortal dilemma, sometimes by manipulating the value of letters. So carrying paper for somebody else, carrying unknown paper, has a terrifyingly negative connotation in folk memory. I see that I am rapidly using up my time, so I'm going to speed up a bit as I bring you the second part of this talk, which is the application of this information about literate ethos in Huarochiri. The territory of the Huarochiri mythology, and the oval shows the place where it was written. The same territory in an excellent 16th century map, which shows you why irrigation is the crux of the matter. The coastal desert of Peru and the west slope of the Andes, upriver in this perspective, is semi-arid territory, most of it is poorly watered, but thickly inhabited, with these villages here shown in their form as Spanish reducción villages, up to the Western Cordillera, from which water comes in the form of ice melt and storms. In other words, as Pariacaca. The heart of the agricultural matter is building and maintaining canals, cleaning them up to get out the algae and landslide dirt. It's a peak occasion in ritual, and it has two terminal functions at the beginning, where humans have to visit the sources of water way the hell up in the mountains, sometimes literally up in the snow, in order to conciliate the divine owners of water. And at the lower end of the job, a few days later, where water debouches into municipal public facilities and irrigation branches, small irrigation canals to which comuneros have access. And here too, the actors are the aylus, are the parcialidades. Each one of these ancient but still vital groups is responsible for one segment of the irrigation system. And every time that it goes out to maintain a segment, it conducts to what they call hora de costumbre. That's the rest break, in which coca is distributed, the superhuman powers are remembered, and writing is done. Who attended, who worked well, who was missing, who made a mistake like forgetting a tool or showing up late. This is all the material that in recent but not remote times was compiled in ayllu quipus. Quipus, great. What about letters? I'll only mention one colonial context. In this old satellite picture, you see San Damian, which is the parish that governed the territory of the Huarochiri manuscript. Tiny high altitude tributaries of the Lurin River descending from the highest lands, and lake water. Those high altitude lakes are precious sources of irrigation. The biggest and most intricate and really very, very impressive chapter of the Huarochiri manuscript is a little encyclopedia or Quechua language treatise about one lake and its relationships with humans. Yansa Lake, the bright spot in the picture, is probably Yansa Lake. Tells about how of old it was captured by mountain-born invaders, how its character is part of the ethos of carnal love, which is also not exactly metaphorically, but sort of in another aspect, the ethos of irrigation. A myth about why the canals and reservoir have the shape that they do, and then descending from this superhuman domain into human practical affairs, rules about the governance of the dam by a priestly lineage, the ritual regimen that those priests must maintain, and then getting right down into the then present 1608, the genealogy of the lake governing lineage. In other words, why it has been transmitted, but not in pure patrilineal form. If you think about it, this is a case of what I call the generic Bible. The table of contents of ancient books very often have substantially the same informational commitments. And so in these lines, the hero of the ancient hero who established the Concha Lake hydraulic system leaves instructions about how it had to be maintained, requiring that all the descendants do this according to the custom. And apparently they did. If you go to Yansa Lake, you can still see the old dam, which is described in that chapter. The description of it explains that it has 5 windows. And here is that little dam of unknown age, which is packed into the outlet, the outflowing aperture of Lake Yansa. And it's quite easy to imagine it being used as is prescribed in the Huarochiri manuscript. Likewise, the ritual regimen is still quite a lot in the old mold. There's an occasion called the anniversary of the lake, when the dignitaries of Concha, the ayllu that owns the lake, have to come and do the honors. Here they are making a speech in which they implore the lake to provide good water. It was quite a touching speech. That was a year of famine, famine due to dryness in East Africa, and somebody must have heard about it on the radio and said, and we ask you, Yansa Lake, to provide as much water as we need, and not just us, but everybody, especially Africans. They prepare their tribute to the lake in the form of a champa. This is a block of entangled roots excavated from the soil, and this is why the ceremony is called champeria. That little block is fashioned into a raft. It's like a little kontiki. I hear someone speaking. Who is that?
I muted them.
Oh, okay. The champa, this is the champa, or the ritual boat, festooned with decorative gift paper and with perfume and tobacco and cigarettes and coca leaves and all kinds of nice things. And then addressed to the lake with a sail that is a document in the form of a bureaucratic list of every comunero household that hopes to draw water from Yansa's irrigation. Then the lettered boat sails out into the water, and when it becomes waterlogged and sinks, people feel overjoyed that it has been well received by the lake owners. Other Huarochirianos, this is a snapshot that a lady holds in her home of her visit to go and meet the divine owners of her water, Pencollo and Mama Katiana. They are 2 presumably pre-Columbian skulls who live in a secret place very high up in the heights of Germania. and they too receive approximately the same honors. The men you see in this picture have just been commissioned as wadis. The wadis are the persons who are temporarily relieved of their baptism and their Christian status so that they can interact with these primordial superhumans. Several things are written at that moment. One of them is the list of their Wade names. These are the names that they will temporarily bear while they're in interaction with superhuman power. They receive from the owners of water a reply. The reply is cryptic. They have to receive it by, quote, telepathy, and then write it to inform the community. The writing of this mystic communication is strange swirls and scribbles. It's not human writing, but it's the job of the wadis to translate it. And this is the act in the ayllu book of the occasion in which they tell the message from the ancient owners of the water with their benison on the community, a blessing, and a promise that says, we will supply the water you need, but we ask that you behave yourself very well all the way. And sometimes there are some admonitions about things that may not have gone right in the community. We got the message and the reply from Mama Katiana and Pencollo. We enjoyed the letter from Mama Katiana and Lord Pencollo of giving us water with the purpose that the Tupicocha comuneros fulfill what they have promised. 1994. On a moment like this, Tupicochanos might well feel that water has been well taught by them, and also that they are being well taught by water. And that's all for today. I would love to hear your questions.